Welcome to another episode of American Scandal Report by Skoob. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and today we're diving into one of the most explosive revelations in American political history, the Pentagon Papers leak. It's 1971, America is deep in the quagmire of Vietnam. Trust in government is cracking. And then, like a bombshell dropped on the American consciousness, a massive classified document lands on the desk of the New York Times, exposing decades of presidential lies, military deceptions, and constitutional violations. This isn't just a story about leaked documents. It's the story of how one man's conscience collided with the most powerful office in the world, how the press fought the government for the right to tell the truth, and how a burglary at a psychiatrist's office would eventually bring down a presidency. So buckle up, because we're about to uncover the secrets that the US government desperately tried to keep buried. Let's start with the man at the center of it all, Daniel Ellsberg. Picture this. It's 1971 and Ellsberg is working at the Rand Corporation, a prestigious think tank with deep ties to the Pentagon. He's not some anti-establishment radical. He's an insider, a former Marine, a Harvard PhD who helped plan nuclear war strategies for the US government. But something changed when Ellsberg got his hands on a document officially known as the Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. Only 15 copies existed, and Rand Corporation had received 2 of them. What Ellsberg discovered as he read through those 7,000 pages would shake him to his core. This wasn't just another policy report. This was a detailed confession of governmental deception spanning multiple presidencies. As Ellsberg later put it, he witnessed what he considered demonstrated unconstitutional behavior by a series of presidents and their subordinates, a systematic violation of their oaths of office. The document revealed something that would shock the American public. Their government had been lying to them about life and death matters for years, and then going to extraordinary lengths to hide that deceit. Ellsberg realized he was holding smoking gun evidence of presidential mendacity on an unprecedented scale. Here was a man who had spent years in the corridors of power, who understood the nuclear chess game between superpowers, yet he was stunned by what he was reading. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable. Ellsberg made a decision that would change his life forever. He was going to photocopy these documents and release them to the public. But here's what makes Ellsberg's story even more fascinating. The Pentagon Papers weren't supposed to be his biggest revelation. According to Ellsberg himself, these documents were just his first leak. He had planned something much more substantial, exposing America's nuclear weapons policy. He had compiled extensive files on nuclear war planning, materials that could have been even more explosive than the Vietnam revelations. But fate intervened in the strangest way. Through what Ellsberg described as a strange sequence of events, his nuclear war files disappeared. They were lost forever, never to be leaked. One can only imagine how different history might have been if those nuclear secrets had seen the light of day alongside the Pentagon Papers. Now let's dive into what those Pentagon Papers actually revealed, starting with one of the most shocking discoveries about President John F. Kennedy's Vietnam strategy. We think we know the story of JFK in Vietnam, the cautious president trying to avoid escalation, right? Well, the Pentagon Papers revealed something far more complex and devious. Picture this scene. It's mid-October 1961. Kennedy is under enormous pressure from his military advisors, led by General Maxwell Taylor, to send combat troops to Vietnam. The Pentagon is pushing hard for military intervention, expressing what the documents described as enthusiasm for US involvement and the deployment of combat forces directly to the president. But Kennedy had a problem. He didn't want to send troops, but he also didn't want to publicly fight with his military leadership. So what did he do? He orchestrated one of the most brazen presidential deceptions in modern history. Kennedy deliberately leaked, or allowed to be leaked, a completely false story to the New York Times. The newspaper reported that military leaders at the Pentagon, including General Taylor, are believed to be hesitant to send organized United States combat units into Southeast Asia. This was a complete fabrication. The Pentagon Papers made it crystal clear. The reality was exactly the opposite. Pentagon leaders, including General Taylor, were eagerly advocating for US involvement. They wanted those combat troops deployed, and they had told Kennedy so directly. The Pentagon Papers noted that it was nearly impossible that this story could have been released without the president's direction or by him personally. Kennedy had deliberately misled the American people about his own military's recommendations. The deception worked exactly as planned. As the papers observed, the Times story had the desired effect. Speculation about combat troops almost vanished from news stories. Kennedy understood what he was doing. He confided to advisor Arthur Schlesinger that the military's push for troops reminded him of Berlin. The troops will march in, the bands will play, the crowds will cheer, and in 4 days everyone will forget. Then we'll be told we need more troops. It's like drinking. The effect wears off, and you have to drink again. So instead of combat units, Kennedy made what he saw as a compromise in November 1961. He expanded America's role by sending military advisors and support personnel, but avoided crossing the line into direct combat engagement. Yet many, including Daniel Ellsberg himself, believed this limited approach couldn't possibly succeed against the growing Viet Cong threat. This revelation about Kennedy was just the beginning of what the Pentagon Papers exposed about presidential deception. If Kennedy's deceptions were shocking, Lyndon Johnson's were absolutely staggering in their scope and audacity. The Pentagon Papers revealed that the Johnson administration had consistently and systematically misled both Congress and the American people about virtually every aspect of the Vietnam War. Here's what was really happening behind closed doors while Johnson was publicly selling America on the Vietnam intervention. The administration was expanding the war's scope to include bombings in Laos and Cambodia and increasing raids on North Vietnam, all without notifying Congress or the American public. This was secret warfare conducted in the shadows while Johnson spoke publicly about limited engagement. But the deception went even deeper than secret bombings. While Johnson was publicly stating that US involvement aimed to protect South Vietnam from communist aggression, he and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara had privately agreed on a completely different objective, containing China. Think about that for a moment. The public was told this was about saving South Vietnam. But privately, Johnson and McNamara knew they were really trying to contain Chinese influence in Southeast Asia. A mission they acknowledged would take enormous amounts of time and money, and would result in massive American casualties. None of this was ever publicly admitted. As Salman Rushdie wrote in his piece, Secrets and Lies, the realization was shocking, that the US government could lie to its citizens about life and death matters, then go to extraordinary lengths to hide its deceit. The Johnson administration had essentially conducted a secret war while lying about its true objectives to the very people whose sons were dying in Vietnamese jungles. The Pentagon Papers contain this alarming information in excruciating detail. Thousands of pages documenting how presidents had systematically violated their constitutional obligations to Congress and the American people. When Daniel Ellsberg read through this evidence of sustained governmental deception, he felt he had no choice but to act. The document exposed not just policy disagreements or political spin, but what appeared to be systematic lying about matters of war and peace. These weren't white lies or minor omissions. These were fundamental deceptions about why Americans were fighting and dying in Southeast Asia. When Daniel Ellsberg finally made his move and leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in 1971, he set in motion one of the most important First Amendment battles in American history. What happened next would forever change the relationship between the press and the presidency. The Times began publishing the classified documents, and immediately the Nixon administration went into overdrive to stop them. The government claimed that the president held the authority to prohibit any publication that could potentially harm the public interest, essentially arguing that national security could trump the First Amendment. But here's where it gets interesting. Nixon wasn't even mentioned in the Pentagon Papers. These documents primarily exposed the lies of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. So why was Nixon so desperate to stop their publication? The answer reveals everything about how presidents view governmental secrecy and their own power. The case quickly escalated to the Supreme Court as New York Times Company versus United States, and it became a landmark ruling in First Amendment history. The American Civil Liberties Union presented an amicus brief emphasizing the vital role of a free press in enlightening the public, especially regarding a war that had deeply divided the nation. The Supreme Court faced a fundamental question. Could the government use vague claims about national security to prevent the press from publishing information that clearly served the public interest? The court ruled decisively in favor of the newspapers, stating that the government had failed to provide a justified reason for restricting the publications. Justice Hugo Black wrote a particularly powerful endorsement, stressing that the press must be safeguarded to reveal government secrets and enlighten citizens. The court held that due to the importance of the documents to discussions about the war and the vague nature of the government's opposition to publication, the traditional classification system could not override First Amendment protections. This ruling fortified the press's role in reporting on government actions and ensuring government accountability to the people. It established a precedent that would shape press freedom for generations to come. But the Nixon administration wasn't finished. If they couldn't stop the publication through the courts, they would go after Daniel Ellsberg himself through the criminal justice system. The Department of Justice charged Ellsberg with violating espionage laws, setting up what would become one of the most dramatic legal battles of the 1970s. Nixon's response to the Pentagon Papers leak reveals the paranoid, authoritarian mindset that would eventually destroy his presidency. Unable to stop publication through the courts, Nixon decided to wage a secret war against Daniel Ellsberg and other anti-war activists. On July 1, 1971, just one day after the Supreme Court overturned Nixon's attempt to suppress the Pentagon Papers, Chuck Colson enlisted ex-CIA officer E. Howard Hunt. Hunt later claimed the initiative initially aimed to damage the Kennedys' reputation through strategically altered information leaks about the Bay of Pigs and the Diem assassination. But when the CIA refused to declassify the materials Nixon wanted leaked, in a twist of historical irony, Nixon's attempts to manipulate American politics led to the first stringent executive order limiting government secrecy. Hunt's propaganda efforts shifted toward creating a specialized team with a very specific mission. They called themselves the Plumbers, supposedly because their job was to stop leaks. But their real mission was to destroy Daniel Ellsberg through any means necessary. Here's where the story gets truly disturbing. In late July, the White House intervened with the CIA to secure fake identity cards and disguise materials for Hunt's use. The CIA also provided a psychological profile of Ellsberg. But when that profile didn't contain enough incriminating material to satisfy the White House, the Plumbers made a shocking suggestion to John Ehrlichman. They should break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to steal his confidential case files. Egil Crow, the chief plumber, later observed something chilling about the planning meeting for this burglary. No one questioned its legality. The focus was solely on the logistics of execution. Think about that. White House officials were planning a felony break-in to steal medical records, and nobody even asked if it was legal. The burglary occurred in September 1971, and it marked the beginning of another Nixon shock that would eventually consume his presidency. The Watergate scandal. The same paranoid mindset, the same willingness to break the law, the same belief that the president was above the Constitution. It all started with Nixon's obsession with Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. But the Plumbers' activities went far beyond just Ellsberg. They were part of a broader campaign against anti-war activists that revealed the true authoritarian nature of the Nixon administration. The Pentagon Papers leak had unleashed something dark in the Nixon White House, a systematic campaign against anyone who opposed the administration's Vietnam policy. Daniel Ellsberg wasn't just facing legal charges. He had become the number 2 target on Nixon's infamous enemies list. As Ellsberg's trial approached in San Diego, the full scope of the government's misconduct began to emerge. The FBI had wiretapped Ellsberg's lawyers, a clear violation of attorney-client privilege. This led to suspicions that White House officials who had already pleaded guilty in the Watergate scandal might also be involved in the persecution of Ellsberg. On April 15th, the government was forced to admit that Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, the same burglars who would later break into the Watergate complex, were behind the break-in at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. But this information reached Judge Matthew Byrne suspiciously late, at the president's request. When Judge Byrne demanded answers, the government had to disclose that both Liddy and Hunt were on the White House payroll during the burglary and had received CIA support for their operation. The same team that had broken into Democratic National Committee headquarters had first cut their teeth burglarizing medical records. John Dean, the White House counsel, confessed to something even more shocking. He and John Ehrlichman had involved the FBI director in a scheme to destroy Hunt's files on Ellsberg, constituting clear obstruction of justice. The corruption reached the highest levels of law enforcement, but the misconduct didn't stop there. It was discovered that Ehrlichman had secretly met with Judge Byrne during the trial and hinted at the possibility of him becoming FBI director, an obvious attempt at bribery. The same White House that claimed to represent law and order was systematically corrupting the justice system. Perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators uncovered that the team that broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office had planned to physically attack Ellsberg at an anti-war rally outside Congress. They were planning to assault the defendant in a case they were simultaneously prosecuting. On May 10th, prosecutors were forced to admit that the FBI had been wiretapping Ellsberg since 1969, long before he leaked the Pentagon Papers. The government had been conducting surveillance on him simply because of his anti-war views. Judge Byrne had seen enough. He dismissed all charges against Ellsberg and his co-defendant, Anthony Russo. The government's case had collapsed under the weight of its own illegality. But Nixon wasn't finished. Even after the charges were dropped, he targeted Ellsberg in a speech at a White House event for returned POWs, denouncing those who leak and publish confidential information. The president was using American prisoners of war as props in his personal vendetta against a whistleblower. The same dirty tricks used against Daniel Ellsberg were deployed against an entire organization, Vietnam veterans against the war. These were men who had served their country in combat, then returned home to oppose the war they had fought. Nixon's response was to treat them as enemies of the state. The extent of government infiltration was staggering. In New Orleans, all three members of the local VVAW chapter were FBI informants. In Jacksonville, Florida, 2 of the 3 members were government infiltrators. The FBI wasn't just watching these veterans. They were essentially running their organizations. In Miami, the FBI and local police went even further, planting drugs in VVAW members' apartments, arresting them, and then trying to recruit them as informants. Think about that. Law enforcement was framing American military veterans, then using those false charges to pressure them into spying on their fellow veterans. Guy Goodwin, the Washington director of this operation, orchestrated what became known as the Gainesville 8 case. He selected a strict judge in Florida named Winston Arno, and federal prosecutors falsely assured him that none of their key witnesses were connected to the government. In reality, these witnesses were paid FBI informants. One of the men who had been involved in planning the attack on Ellsberg, Pablo Manuel Fernandez, was also working as a police informant in this case. The same network of government agents was being used against multiple targets. During the trial, Scott Camel's lawyer's office was broken into and his case file stolen, the same burglary tactics used against Ellsberg's psychiatrist. Goodwin was spotted coaching a witness in the courthouse hallway, even though he had no official standing in the proceedings. When John Mitchell, Nixon's Attorney General, denied any government involvement in setting up the defendants, Judge Arno blocked the defense from cross-examining him and dismissed many of their questions. The fix seemed to be in, but then something remarkable happened. Mid-trial, 2 FBI agents were caught maintaining recording devices in the defense's conference room. Unlike the Ellsberg case, where the judge dismissed charges due to government misconduct, this case went to a jury, and the jury found the defendants not guilty. Despite all the government infiltration, despite the planted evidence, despite the surveillance and the false testimony, 12 ordinary Americans looked at the evidence and refused to convict these veterans for opposing a war they had fought. Here's what's crucial to understand about Nixon's response to the Pentagon Papers and his campaign against anti-war activists. It wasn't really about national security. It was about winning re-election in 1972. Richard Nixon's actions were primarily driven by his political survival. The formation of the Plumbers, the campaign against Ellsberg, and the efforts to use the FBI and CIA against the anti-war movement were all wrapped in national security rhetoric, but they were actually about controlling the political landscape for the upcoming election. Nixon understood that a lost war, stalled peace talks, or a political crisis in South Vietnam could all jeopardize his chances of winning a second term. His Vietnam strategy was similarly motivated. Every decision filtered through the lens of electoral politics. Throughout 1971, one of Nixon's primary concerns was the upcoming re-election of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. Thieu's election preceded Nixon's and represented the next major challenge for Washington's Vietnam strategy. Even military operations were planned partly to support Thieu's re-election chances. This political calculation explains why Nixon was so threatened by the Pentagon Papers, even though they primarily exposed the lies of his Democratic predecessors. The documents didn't just reveal that Kennedy and Johnson had lied about Vietnam. They revealed the systematic nature of presidential deception about war and peace. If Americans learned that presidents routinely lied about matters of life and death, How could Nixon maintain credibility for his own Vietnam policies? If the classification system was exposed as a tool for hiding governmental mistakes rather than protecting national security, how could Nixon use secrecy to control the political narrative? The Pentagon Papers threatened to establish a precedent that the American people had a right to know the truth about what their government was doing in their name. For an administration built on secrecy and manipulation, this was an existential threat. The public fallout from the Pentagon Papers case was seismic and lasting. The US government was now widely perceived as using classification to hide its mistakes and promote an unpopular, unjustified war. The mystique of governmental authority had been shattered. But the real transformation came in 1972, when the same mindset that produced the Pentagon Papers burglary led to the Watergate break-in. Nixon's paranoia, his belief that he was above the law, his willingness to use government agencies against political opponents, it all culminated in the scandal that would force his resignation. This sequence of events marked a fundamental shift in media-government relations. Investigative journalists were now seen as heroes defending the First Amendment, while government officials were viewed as potentially deceitful villains using national security claims to hide their errors and wrongdoing. The Pentagon Papers case also sparked the emergence of a new type of activist, those who viewed government secrecy itself as a problem to be confronted and eliminated. The idea that citizens had a right to know what their government was doing gained unprecedented momentum. Interestingly, none of these public cases had any direct relation to nuclear weapons, even though that had been Ellsberg's original area of expertise and his planned focus for even more dramatic revelations. The US Supreme Court continued to rule that Congress could be excluded from sensitive nuclear weapons information under certain conditions. But these changing attitudes about government and press roles coincided with diminishing respect for institutions like the Atomic Energy Commission. Much of the mystery of nuclear technology had faded during the 1960s, ironically assisted by the AEC's success in taming the atom. Even David Lilienthal, who had once viewed atomic energy as civilization's turning point, suggested by 1963 that the AEC should be abolished, arguing that the atom had not lived up to the unique status Congress had given it in 1946. The Pentagon Papers had revealed something that would reshape American politics. The classification system was being used not to protect national security, but to protect politicians from accountability. This realization would fuel decades of battles over government transparency, freedom of information, and the public's right to know. As we close this chapter, remember, the Pentagon Papers weren't just about Vietnam. They were about whether the people have the right to know what's done in their name. One man with a conscience exposed decades of deception. And in doing so, he forced a nation to confront the uncomfortable truth. Secrecy can be as dangerous as war itself. But what if Ellsberg had stayed silent? What if the press had been silenced? This scandal wasn't just a leak. It was a turning point in the battle between truth and power. And its legacy still shapes how we think about press, freedom, national security, and government accountability. Want to hear what really happened behind the scenes? And how close we came to losing it all? Download the Skoob app now to unlock the full story and discover the moments that changed history when one man decided the truth was worth the risk.